So today we're going to be continuing with our last topic, which is sustainability in the local San Diego region. We started with water, and we'll be moving on today to automobility, highways, sprawl, and suburbia. What are the consequences of this type of settlement, social organization, and transportation? Why are we setting our cities up, our settlements up this way? Is it sort of an inevitable result of human population growth? We have more people and we need somewhere to put them. Or is the story more complicated? Um, if we made different choices, if we set things up differently, would we have different, more sustainable outcomes? And so that's what we'll be talking about today. Before getting into the material, a couple of announcements. You have your third exam, the final exam, coming up a week from this Thursday. So Thursday, May 14th. And it has to be taken on this day, unlike the other assignments. SDSU requires that we all take the final during our scheduled time. Our scheduled time is from 8 to 10. And I've made it longer. So instead of a 2-hour period, you have a 4-hour period, a little bit of flexibility in there within which to take the exam. So you can begin anytime after 8 a.m. You have to be done and submit the exam before 12 p.m. noon. There's the multiple choice section, which will be about 35 questions like always, and then the essay portion worth 30% of the exam score. And so you have 2 hours to take the multiple choice section from the time you begin, anytime between 8 and 12. Make sure you finish before 12, and then you can turn the essay in anytime also between 8 and 12. You should study and prepare for the exam in advance. It's open book by nature because you're taking it at home, but it's not designed to give you time to search through the material for each answer to each question. You should study and prepare in advance like you were going to be taking it in class. And as with exam 2, for exam 3, I have also told you ahead of time which essay question I will put on the exam. So see the study guide. You know what question I'm going to ask you ahead of time. You may and you should prepare your response to the essay question in advance and then use that during the exam. Type it up and then submit it once you begin the exam turn it in on Blackboard. I really urge you to take advantage of this. That way you've got 30% of the exams nailed. And even though only one of the questions will be on the exam, preparing for all of them is going to help you with the multiple choice section as well. One last note, and this is really important, when writing your essay, especially because we're doing it from home, it's really important you use your own words. Otherwise, it'll be considered plagiarism. So just make sure you're doing that. Contact me if you have any questions about that. So study, write the essay ahead of time, and the exam's May 14th, Thursday. You can take it anytime between 8 and 12, but have to be done by 12. A few other tips. Read the whole study guide. It tells you exactly what you're responsible for. The multiple choice is just this last third of the class. The essay question has a slight cumulative component. It's nothing to panic about. You have the question ahead of time. You don't need to go restudy all the material. Maybe there's a concept that we talked about earlier on in the class that you need to incorporate into the essay question. Hint, hint. So go back and refresh yourself on that concept. That's the extent of the cumulative nature of the essay. Nothing to really panic about. You have the question ahead of time. Just prepare accordingly. And for your essay response, don't simply string together a list of loosely related facts. Illustrate and explain the concepts and examples you draw upon to support your argument and support the points you're making. Illustrate it concisely and appropriately. Most of you did very well on your last essay. And then again, review the material. Lectures, readings, and films are all fair game. Review it as many times as you need to till it starts to stick. If you have any questions about the exam, material, the format, anything, contact me. Okay, so we'll talk about that one more time before the exam is a little over a week from today. One final announcement. I have made one last extra credit opportunity available to all of you. I announced it last week in lecture 23 on water, and I also posted instructions for it on Blackboard, and I sent an announcement and email about that. The assignment is related to this default framing for sustainability that we've been discussing. In other words, the individualization of responsibility for environmental problems. This is the default. This is the go-to. This is the way we understand and attempt to solve environmental problems. We talked about that with water, and we'll talk more about that a bit today. And so for the assignment, see the lecture, especially the end of lecture 23, for instructions and how to do it. And the lecture itself is important to understanding how to do it correctly. And then also make sure you see the instructions on Blackboard. Note that if you choose to do this assignment, you need to complete it in full and adhere to the instructions in order to receive credit. It's sort of all or nothing. It's not a complicated assignment. It entails taking a picture of something that reflects the default frame. The example I gave you in the water lecture was of a please recycle on a water bottle label. And they also sponsored National Forest, Crystal Geyser. That was the example I gave you. Please don't give me 80 examples of water bottle labels. So take a picture of something that reflects this default frame, this individualization of responsibility, and then write 4 to 6 sentences max that address specific questions I'm asking you, namely who's behind the message, what's the message, how does it reflect the default frame, and then this last part, which asks you to think a little bit, what might be a more organizational or structural message that doesn't focus on the individual. This last part requires you to think a bit and sort of come up with something. The assignment is worth 4 points, which may not seem like a lot, but that's 1% of your final grade for the course. So that's the difference between a C and a B and an A. Again, it's fairly straightforward, especially if you've been covering the material, and doing it should help solidify course concepts for you, as well as help you prepare for our final exam. So if you choose to do it, it is due on Turn It In on Blackboard this coming Sunday, May 10th, by the end of the day, by 11:59 p.m. Okay, so today, automobility, highways, sprawl, and suburbia. Why are we setting up our cities this way? A couple of questions to sort of warm us up. And you can just answer these questions for yourself. I have spent most of my life living in a suburb. True for me, yes. And typically, we usually do this in class. We're online right now. Many people in the class answered yes. I grew up in a house that had a large lawn or a lawn. Personally, for me, also yes. And I grew up in Reno, Nevada, where it's a desert and 100% of the consumptive water is used for agriculture. We literally don't have water there, but we have lots of large lawns. And last, I usually, if we were actually coming to campus right now, drive to school alone. Is this true for you or not? And for those of you that drove to school, that typically drive to school, myself included, the question is why? Typically we hear, oh yeah, it's convenient. We like our cars. I would love a convenient public transportation system right now. I could get work done while I was riding the transit system. I wouldn't have to worry about gas, insurance, parking, all this other stuff that comes with driving. And so many of us drive because of sort of convenience or because of our schedule, but also because we don't really have other viable alternatives or options that work for us. Like, for example, I work at SDSU and I also teach at Palomar in San Marcos. I teach 4 different classes, 2 different days at each school with some different times every single semester, anywhere from 8 a.m. up in San Marcos to 8 p.m. at San Diego State. So public transportation is really not an option for me. I have to be different places all over the county, close together, and there's just not really an alternative that can do that for me other than driving right now. And so many of us, even if we don't want to drive, we don't really have a lot of other options available to us. And this is not an accident. This is not a reflection of the fact that people just like cars. That is not the whole story. And so a main question for today is sprawl natural? Sprawl, the spread out of our settlement. Is the U.S. love of the automobile, the love of driving? We all have our own personal cars. Is this why we drive? Because we love it, because that's what we want. If you take sort of the individual, the default frame that focuses on individuals, what they want, what they do, the story is that we have sprawl, we have lots of cars because people like to live in the suburbs and they like to drive. If this is true, then it would seem sprawl and automobility would be somewhat inevitable fate. That's what people want. Ultimately, that's what people are going to do. If this is not true, if it's not inevitable fate, is the story more complex? Were there choices? Is there other options that we could have taken? Quick question. What percent of housing cities that will be built needed because of population growth by 2050 are not yet built? What percent has not yet been built? And the answer to that is 2/3, and by some estimates, much higher. And so we have lots of choices about where and how those houses are built. Focusing on a more structural organizational view of why we are where we are today might give us some insight into potentially more sustainable alternatives to sprawl and automobility. Excuse me. If you take a structural organizational view, meaning look at how the system has been set up over time, politically, economically, socially, taking a structural organizational view creates a different view. Driving cars, sprawl development do not equal inevitable fate. They are a result of specific choices that have been made by people over time, and also specific policies, especially subsidies. Where do we spend our tax dollars? And so to assess this question of is sprawl, is automobility inevitable fate, we're going to ask a couple of questions. One, were our choices just natural? Choosing to drive, choosing to live in sprawl developments, are these alone our choices? And would different choices lead to different outcomes? The way things are set up today is not something God wanted. It's not something that's inevitable or set in stone. It's about choices, policy choices, and in many cases, perverse subsidies that have created and even incentivized sprawl and car use. The cartoon on the side, that's from from the New Yorker, I think. The auto show was going to be held at the Javits Center. But the cartoon is sort of the end of the affair. You know, people are sick of cars. We were promised freedom and liberty over 100 years ago, and all we've gotten is a burden, rising gas prices, all these other problems. And it's a dysfunctional marriage. She's been cheating on the car with public transit, bicycles, all these other suitors that she's looking to switch over to. It's a silly joke. And so you should have read for today an article by Steinberg in The Obsessive Quest for the Perfect Lawn. 2 chapters from the book, his book, one on Live Free and Mow, about the rise of the green lawn. Why do we have lawns in the US? Why is that a thing? And how many of you have really thought about that before today? Maybe some of you because you're in sustainability. And then the second chapter, the Levitt legacy, which essentially explains the factorization, the Fordism, the McDonaldization, as I like to call it, of housing, factory mass-produced housing, and the lawn is an important part of that. So if you haven't, make sure that you read this. It'll be relevant for the quiz and for the exam. And so just in basic terms, before talking about Steinberg, first, externalities. Externalities are things that are not priced into the actual cost of something. It's not included in the price tag. These costs, be it social or environmental, are externalized. So that when you fly on an airplane, you pay for the ticket, you pay for a bunch of stuff, but in that price tag for the ticket, there's no cost for CO2 emissions or pollution or contributing to global warming and climate change. That cost on the environment is externalized. It's not included in the price tag. We don't actually pay for those costs. They're externalized onto the environment or onto other populations. For example, through exploitative wages, lack of health care, unsafe labor conditions, all these things that help create cheap products for the producer and the consumer. Big reason is because we don't pay the true cost. One reason that people live in sprawl developments is because they don't actually pay the true cost of what it costs to live out there. So sprawl, to define it for you, it's a loose term for the spread of city areas. So informally means that. The technical definition for sprawl development is when there is less than 3 units per acre of land. So less than 3 houses or 3 dwellings per acre. The non-technical definition is dispersed development. We're spread out rather than concentrated. And so Steinberg talks about in the reading that there's so many externalities, social, environmental, health costs, that aren't actually included in the price tag of suburban sprawled living, or having these large lawns. And the lawn is really an interesting thing. He talks about the lawn as one of the leading crops in America. We plant twice as much acreage to growing turf as we do to cotton. The amount of turf we grow at the time he was writing the article was equal to at least the size of Kentucky, maybe the size of Florida. At the time he was writing, there was some 58 million homeowners that had lawns, 16,000 golf courses. The lawn industry is a huge multi-billion-dollar business per year. $40 billion per year to be exact in the lawn care industry. This is more, the $40 billion that Americans spend on lawn care is more than the entire gross domestic product of the country of Vietnam. And so why do Americans have this obsession with the green lawn? In part because they don't actually have to pay the true cost. It's not priced in, it's not readily apparent. The water, the resources, the fossil fuels, the pollution, all that is externalized. And so Steinberg goes through this examples of things that are externalized from lawn care. And so I just want to read, it's page 8 through 9. The following is a list of some of the things the turf industry does not want you to know. These are externalities. Between 1994 and 2004, an estimated average of 75,884 Americans per year were injured with lawnmowers. This is roughly the same amount of people injured by firearms. Second, using a gas-powered, this is one of my favorites, using a gas-powered leaf blower for half an hour creates as many polluting hydrocarbon emissions as driving a car 7,700 miles at a speed of 30 miles per hour. 7,700 miles a car can go. That's how much hydrocarbons you emit half hour using a leaf blower. Next one, nearly half of all the households sampled in one study failed to carefully read and follow the label directions when using pesticides and fertilizer. The effect is they usually use way more than they're supposed to, which goes into our soil, our groundwater, and other places in our environment. Approximately 7 million birds die each year because of lawn care pesticides. In the process of refueling their lawnmowers, leaf blowers, and other garden equipment, Americans spill about 17 million gallons of gasoline every summer, or about 50% more oil than marred the Alaskan coast during the notorious Exxon Valdez disaster. You guys might be a little young for that one. Exxon spilled a shitload of oil in the Alaskan coast, and they'd never really cleaned it up. A single golf course in Tampa, Florida, a state that leads the nation with over 1,000 of these emerald green creations, a single golf course uses 178,800 gallons of water per day. That's enough to meet the daily water needs of more than 2,200 Americans. Suburban households and lawn care operators apply more herbicides per acre on lawns than most farmers spread to grow crops. Remember when we were talking about industrial agriculture and eutrophication of our fresh water, toxifying of our soil, of our air, of our groundwater? Same thing with all these chemicals that home care lawn experts are using. And two more. This is maybe my favorite. Diazinon. For decades, a widely used lawn care pesticide, similar in chemical composition to nerve gas, but touted as safe, was finally banned by the EPA in 2000. And yet, a loophole allowed retailers to go right on selling it as late as 2002. To keep your lawn healthy, they're selling you nerve gas that they're telling you is safe, even though it's been banned by the EPA. Last one, lawn chemicals are commonly tracked into the home or they build up on the carpet, thus placing small children whose developing bodies are far more vulnerable to toxins at risk of chronic exposure. So these are some of the externalities, the things not included in the true cost of having a large lawn. Just a couple of other things from Steinberg. In the second chapter, the Levitt legacy, this is the factorization of housing. Building housing basically became a factory model at this point. It has to do with a lot of things going on at the time. It's post-World War II. Federal government got involved and began subsidizing building to create jobs and also to provide housing. And so when this money became available, the Lovett and his sons got involved instead of in luxury building in building low-cost housing. And they built like 17,000 homes in a 4-year period. And so what they did is in the past, when you built a home, you would have to excavate that site. So on the East Coast and the West Coast, we don't have a lot of basements, but on the East Coast, almost everyone has a basement. So you have to excavate that out, fill it in, create a foundation, do all this stuff. To save money and time, instead of doing any of that, what they did is they just bulldozed over the entire lot, poured a concrete slab. That's your foundation. Build the house on that, and then plant a lawn over the scarred landscape and heal the land. And with the lawn, concrete slab, the bulldozing, and the subsidized housing, thus the factory model of housing production. Another thing going on at the time is there was all this agricultural land that was being bought up for really cheap by real estate developers. Specifically, Steinberg talks about potato farmers sort of going out of business. And as they go out of business, developers came by and bought up the land at really cheap prices. So, and then with the housing subsidies, they built on it. The result overall of the factorization of housing is that one house was being built at this time every 24 minutes. Truly like a factory. And they would even brag that each house only took up 12% of the lot. You want to know why we have sprawl? These are some of the reasons. There's also several other developments that go into the rise of the lawn, cultural status markers, having the space, having the time to take care of it, the money to pay people to take care of it. Also technological changes, the rise of the powered mower is essentially what democratized the lawn. It used to be reserved sort of for the affluent. With the powered mower, you don't need to have money to pay people to take care of your lawn. You can mow it yourself. And so technology also spread this cultural development. And so literally, what are we doing? It takes over 2 inches a week to water a lawn. And I mean, in California, we don't even have water. So much water goes into the lawn that it actually leaches the soil of nutrients and minerals needed to make the plants grow. Then when we mow the lawn, instead of letting the clippings stay to let that decaying vegetation re-enter the soil as nutrients, we remove them because it doesn't look pretty, right? Like what people think it should look like that. Because we remove the potential fertilizing decaying matter, we have to use artificial fertilizer to keep the lawn growing. This keeps it growing, needs more water, it grows fast, has to be cut. You get rid of the clippings, it's not being fertilized, you gotta add fertilizer. So we water, we fertilize, we mow, and we repeat. They said people spend like a day to half a day a week working just maintaining their lawn. For fucking what? How did we get on board this? Right? And so that's sort of what Steinberg goes through. He goes through all these developments that led to the rise of the lawn, which is not a sustainable thing to be doing. And again, there's other things that come into play. The Federal Housing Administration, federal policy, the federal interstate highway system makes traveling out to these areas possible at this time. GI Bill allowed soldiers to buy housing. All sorts of other policies and subsidies come together at this time to help incentivize, encourage, and even actually create sprawl. And so what are the consequences of sprawl? There are many, environmental and social. Environmentally, sprawl means we're more spread out. It means we have to drive more. We need more spread out infrastructure to fuel our homes. One of the consequences of this is air pollution. Also increased global warming. Climate change is being driven by increased CO2 emissions through all the fossil fuels we're burning. Lead from gasoline. Lead was banned in gasoline in 1970, but there's still high levels of lead on the streets in many areas. And exposure to this can actually impair cognitive function. There's different studies that have linked lower IQ in the inner city to high levels of lead on the streets. Fossil fuel depletion, resource depletion is another consequence. The U.S. uses more fossil fuels to move around for transportation than most other countries, if not all other countries. Per year, per person driving, the average American uses about 59,000 megajoules. It's a measure of energy. I will not ask you about it, but it's a way to measure internationally energy use. In comparison, the average European only uses about 13,000 megajoules per year. And all of these consequences, all of these environmental impacts are made worse by the more vehicle miles traveled. And vehicle miles traveled, VMT, is on the rise. If you look at the graph, this comes from the Delaware Valley Regional Planning Commission. And in Delaware, and I have had a few students from Delaware that can attest to this, it's extremely sprawled out, very spread out, so that if you want to go see a friend, you know you're getting in the car for 20 or 30 minutes. And it's not, or you want to go to school, 20, 30-minute drive. It's not because there's traffic like here. It's because everything is so spread out. So if you look at the graph from 1980 to 2007, the yellow line, transit ridership, that's decreased. Orange, population, no significant increase. Employment, no real change. Vehicles, people own a few more vehicles, but annual vehicle miles traveled has increased at a rate higher than all of these. So it's not proportional to more people. It's not proportional to more cars, to more jobs that people have to drive to. We're just driving more, and part of the reason is because of how we're setting up our cities. They're sprawled, they're spread out. Just a couple of things from the Delaware Valley Regional Planning Commission. Because sprawl is such a problem there, they're actually working on redesigning the city, something called re-centralization, to deal with the issues this is going to have in the future. So a couple of facts. Delaware Valley, between 1930 and 1970, the region's land developed at 3.5 times the rate of population growth. Between 1970 and 2005, the land development rate actually accelerated to 7 times the rate of population growth. The resulting erosion of transit options and access has perpetuated a dramatic shift to automobile use. So they haven't been investing in public transit. People have become more and more spread out. The land's being developed at a higher rate than population growth. It's not even comparative. And so people are driving more and more. According to the DVRPC, the Delaware Valley Planning Commission, between 1980 and 2000, the number of automobiles in the region increased by 37%. And the number of vehicle miles traveled increased by 52%, despite a population increase of only 7%. One of the results is in this region, the average commute time ranks among the longest in the United States. Another thing is they have a large baby boomer population. And so by 2025, about 1 in 5 residents in the region are going to be over the age of 65. And not having access to public transit can be a major problem for mobility of this aging population that can't necessarily drive, but needs to get to the store, needs to get to the doctor, and all these other places. And so it's a huge concern. They're talking about re-centralization, essentially focusing development, future development, house building, business building around transit nodes. So build where transportation already exists, rather than building on empty land and then building infrastructure to get out there. They say the re-centralization scenario, it could increase transit ridership by 14% because it's actually convenient now, right? You live and work and have access to public transit all in the same area. It could also reduce vehicle miles traveled by about 1.7 billion miles because people have options. They don't have to drive so far all the time. They'd also add a lot of houses and jobs along these transit nodes. Alternatively, by not doing this, by continuing to sprawl, there'll be less access, people will become more sprawled, and the problems will become more exacerbated. And so it's one alternative, re-centralization, encouraging alternative forms of transportation, and it has several different benefits. I mean, one, it increases mobility choices. It preserves more open space because you're not filling it up with concrete. It reduces energy demands. It lowers household and business expenses because you're not having to travel so far. It's a dense, more compact, mixed land settlement. It shortens the distance between your destinations. It also encourages alternate forms of transportation. Less energy use means less CO2 emissions, and overall it'll make the region more sustainable. Also, instead of spending money on trying to fix existing infrastructure, they can spend that money on investing in green and energy efficient technology. And so in turn, that will actually help the region in the future remain economically competitive in this rapidly changing world. So it's one example, one possible solution. This is also from the Delaware Valley Planning Commission. And it's showing you the same thing again over time. The amount of people driving alone to commute is almost 80%. That's only increased. Small amount of people carpooling, but that's decreased. Public transportation, walking and working from home have not increased. People are driving more because that's really one of the only options they have. There's not viable public transit options. And keep in mind, this is not an accident. This was designed for us. Other key consequences of sprawl: specific environmental damage in the form of loss of green space, habitat destruction. You can see this in color in the time-lapse map. It shows the California coast pre-colonial, circa 1775 and so on, up until 2007 in the bottom right corner in blue. And you can see land use has increased, and it's not simply proportionate to population growth. In fact, there's a highly disproportionate land use. We're not using more space because we have more people. Rather, it's because of the way we're designing our settlement, the way we're planning and structuring policies. Examples: from 1970 to 1990, the New York metropolitan population grew by 5%. During this same time, land use increased by 61%. Cleveland, the population actually declined by 11%, land use up 33%. Phoenix, eating up 1 acre per hour. Chicago, the population grew 4% during this time, land area use up 46%. It's not just environmental consequences, there's also social consequences from sprawl. Damage to our central cities in the form of unemployment and lack of jobs, lack of resources, food deserts. There's huge unemployment in urban and city centers. One reason for that is many jobs have moved out of the city into the suburbs because of sprawl, and because it's cheaper to operate in these sprawl developments than in the city. We'll talk more about why that is later on. And the people lowest down on the socioeconomic ladder have been hurt by this most, those that can't afford cars to get out into the suburbs. For example, unemployment in city centers, Chicago from, again, 1970 to 1990. Again, the population increased by 4% only, but land use was up by 46% because people are moving out to the suburbs, sprawling. Employment, as a result, was up 24% in the suburbs, but down 17% during this same time period in the city, because the jobs are moving out to the suburbs because it's cheaper to operate out there. Also, the agricultural lands around the city were paved so people can drive out to the suburbs. There's now 2,000 plus vacant manufacturing sites in the cities because, again, the jobs have all moved out. And as in most cities, 25% of the African American population doesn't have access to cars. And so they can't drive out to the suburbs to go to work. Sprawl has hurt those at the bottom of the economic spectrum most. It's not just urban and more impoverished or marginalized populations, it's affluent suburbanites that are affected by sprawl too. Think about the amount of time people spend alone, commuting in their cars, isolated. We are not built for this as humans, right? We're dogs, not cats. We're social creatures. And one result of this is we're spending more time commuting, getting to our different destinations, driving alone, and we're spending less time interacting socially. The result is diminishing interpersonal ties, commitments, and social connections. For example, you can see this in changing volunteer rates. And so this great book, Bowling Alone, written by Putnam, sort of talks about this, the collapse and revival of American community. And so what he uses different examples. The example I'll show you is about bowling leagues. And he says in 1980 to 93, Bowling was up by 10%. People were bowling more, but doing it as individuals. At the same time, bowling leagues, people coming together as an organized group, was down by 40%. What you're seeing is people are doing more things as individuals versus groups. There's less community. And group interaction is important, right? Social interaction, interpersonal relationships matter. This is key to solving and working on problems collectively, right? As an individual, you might feel passionate about an issue. You might be pissed off, but individuals aren't likely to see collective action as the solution, right? You need a group, an organization for that. If these large organizations and corporations are the major barriers to sustainability, we can't address that as individuals. We have to address it collectively. Groups, grassroots action, bottom up, social organization, student associations at SDSU on campus. These organizations, these groups get stuff done. A quick shout out to Green Love, right? One of the main sustainability organizations on campus. They're responsible for all sorts of initiatives. The bike lanes, the ban on plastic bag use, involved in the new student union, which is double LEED platinum certified. It's one of the most sustainable buildings in the world, one of 26 that has that certification in the world. Just recently, Green Love and the sustainability organization students, sorry, I don't know the names of the exact organization, they got the whole university to commit to a climate action plan on paper, meaning SDSU actually back up their words. So groups get things done. This matters. What's more dangerous, ignorance or apathy? Answer, I don't know, ignorant, and I don't give a damn, apathetic. Both of these are problems, right? The price good men pay, I think Plato said this, the price good men or humans pay for apathy, for indifference, is to be ruled by evil men, right? If you're not involved, someone else will be, and they may not share your values. A competitive edge research study calculated that San Diego County ranks pretty low, actually, when it comes to being civically engaged. They rank 43 out of 51 major metropolitan areas. What is civic engagement? What it sounds like, it being engaged civically with your community, volunteerism, voting, electing leaders that share your values, working with neighbors, participating in groups. These things help communities get things done. They push through adversity, come up with collective solutions to collective problems. And the cities ranked high get more things done. San Diego ranked high in volunteerism, 26, but very low in group participation, 46 out of 51. And so why do we have sprawl? Why do we drive our cars? Why did most of us drive to school if we had actually come to school today alone? And the typical dominant narrative is convenience, the freedom to go where you want, when you want, personal choice. I can leave when I want, I can go when I want, I can come when I want. Comfort, luxury, I can listen to my music. There's all these different reasons. All of it centers around individual choice, right? Because we want to, because it does this for us. Right, the natural lure of the open road, and this is even in car commercials, right, where people are up snowboarding in the mountains and then they take their SUV down and they're surfing and they're all cool and sexy, even though when you're actually driving around California, usually you're on the I-5 getting flipped off, stuck in rush hour traffic, right? Not really what it looks like on the commercials. And so this dominant framing is that sprawl is inevitable, autos are inevitable because of the natural lure of the open road, because people want to drive cars, therefore we have lots of cars. This is what we call a privileged account. It's sort of a taken for granted assumption. Why do we have a lot of cars? Oh, because people like to drive. That is not the whole story. There's a theorist, well known, Michel Foucault, has this concept of embedded power. And Michel Foucault says this is the most powerful kind of power. It's the most effective kind of power because it's invisible. it's embedded. It's built into the way that we think about the world around us, the way that we talk about issues, the discourse that shapes our conversations. It's built in. And because it's built into the way we think and talk and thus behave, it's again invisible. It's not noticed. It's taken for granted. Also known as these privileged accounts, sort of the default, the go-to. Oh, why do we drive? Well, we like cars. Why do we have sprawl? Oh, we like to live in the suburbs. That is not the whole story. These are taken for granted assumptions, right? And this is what makes the default framing so effective is that it's invisible. It's built into how we talk, how we think about and understand different issues. And it frames how we think about stuff, and therefore it frames the solutions we're able to come up with. Examples of privileged accounts of default frames. U.S. energy needs, when politicians talk about oil and fossil fuels and foreign policy, we have U.S. energy needs. Words matter, right? Think about the connotation of our needs, meaning, wow, we better get this or we're going to be in trouble. What if instead of saying energy needs, we said U.S. energy wants, or U.S. energy uses, or even U.S. energy abuses, right? The way you frame it, the way you say it, shapes how people perceive it and understand it. Embedded power, built into the way that we talk and think. It's unnoticed, it's taken for granted, it's invisible. Oh, we have environmental problems, take shorter showers, use less water. You, default frame, the individual can solve our problems. Great, 80% of water goes to agriculture in California. Taking shorter showers is never gonna solve shit. Doesn't mean it doesn't matter, it does matter, but it's not the majority of the problem. Or another privileged account or discourse, the one sustainability that you often hear politicians on one side of the aisle say, typically the right, sustainability, environmental stuff, justice, that will cause economic harm and job loss, right? And it's taken for granted. People just assume that to be true when there's no empirical evidence for that, right? We could almost probably say the opposite. And so I want to talk for just a minute about ideology. That's what we're talking about, ideology, your understanding of the world. And if you want to control the world, if you want to have all the power, you want people to do what you want them to do, you want to rule the world, you don't fucking do it with a gun in someone's face. You don't do it with an army. You don't do it with physical force or coercion. Eventually, people will rise up. They will fight back. They will not listen to you. Eventually, the system will break. You don't do it with physical force. If you want to rule the world, you do it via ideology. You do it by influencing the way that people understand their situation and their place in the world. So a quick example to step out of sustainability for just a minute. In my cultural anthropology class, we talk about inequality. And one privileged account, common discourse, or ideology in this country is called the bootstrap ideology. And it's this notion that you too can achieve the wealth, power, status of the elites. You just need to pick yourself up by your bootstraps and try hard enough. And so anthropologists argue that this ideology, and if you don't buy into it, I don't, then it's not an effective ideology for you. But a lot of people in this country do. And so anthropologists argue this is why the bootstrap ideology is why a lot of inequality is actually tolerated in the US, because people believe that they too can move up in life if they just work hard enough, right? We're a merit-based system in which we're all equal, in theory, right? That's not actually true. And so if you want to rule the world, you don't do it with armed force. You don't control people with a gun. You do it by influencing the way they understand the world and their place in it. And so I want to read just a brief excerpt from my cultural anthropology book that talks about, it's talking about ideology and inequality. And going on about how if you try to control people by armed force or an army, eventually that's going to alienate more people. Eventually, it's not going to work. They explain why. And so they go on to talk about ideology and say, it helps elites maintain their privileges if they can influence the perceptions of the underprivileged about why they are underprivileged. For example, if poor people think it is God's will that they are poor, they are less likely to rebel than if they believe they are poor because of exploitation. Or if they think the elite use their property and power to benefit everyone in the society, i.e., trickle down theory, if they think that, then they are less likely to challenge the elite. Or if they think that a concentration of property and power is inevitable because that's just the way human life is, they will be less likely to resist. Or if they think that they too can acquire property, power, and prestige through their own achievements, they are more likely to put their effort into improving their own position rather than taking the risk of being punished or killed. Finally, if the masses are divided internally on the basis of values, ethnic identities, real threats from enemies, perceived threats from others, religious attachments, regional loyalties, and so forth, then they are less likely to unite in the political arena. To state a general point, if members of the lower strata adopt a set of beliefs that justifies and legitimizes the rewards received by the higher strata, then they are more likely to try to join the system rather than to beat it. In such beliefs, the elite have a powerful and relatively cheap tool with which to dampen opposition to their power and privileges. Moreover, these ideas increase the prestige of the elites. If people believe that inequality is the will of the gods, or that the activities of the elite benefit all, trickle down, or that the elite became elite through intelligence and hard work, then the elite deserve the honor and respect of everyone else. Not surprisingly, elites find it easy to believe such things about themselves. We call those ideas and beliefs that explain inequality as desirable or legitimate ideologies. Of course, that's one way to explain inequality and not the way that I would explain it. But the bootstrap ideology, it keeps people sort of plugging away in an otherwise absurd system where there isn't necessarily a chance for them to make it to the top. And so back to sort of bringing it into sustainability, ideology, these privileged frameworks, these assumptions that underlie our worldviews and understanding of the way the world works, this is really, really powerful because it's unnoticed. It's built into the way we think and talk and behave. And so it's not even apparent to us. And this allows it to continue to perpetuate. Okay, so traffic problems on San Diego freeways. When most city leaders are asked about traffic problems, what is the default response? We need more freeways. We need more roads. Yet, if you will note, 75% of traffic, 3/4 of traffic is just one person per car. On the slide, 2011 article, debate continues over possible I-5 expansion. There's a big old debate over expanding the I-5 to alleviate congestion because of environmental and other concerns. Well, as of 2016, it is happening. And so they could add up to 6 lanes to the I-5. The typical rationale is traffic jams are a result of not enough freeways. And we need freeways and roads because people want to drive. We love cars. We like to have our own personal vehicles. It's a result of individual choice. This explanation, this focus on the individual's love of cars and therefore we need more roads, this misses so much of the story. It misses the organizational and structural policies that encourage and in fact create sprawl. Quick question. What place in the world has more freeways than any other city in the world? Some hints. This city has more miles or lanes of freeway than any other city in the world. Some of the nation's worst air pollution. 60% of the total land area is devoted to freeways, streets, driveways, parking, and some of the worst traffic. And if you haven't guessed it, the answer is LA, right? And so in Los Angeles, most of the land is devoted to cars. 60% devoted to sort of storing and feeding and caring for our cars. And yet it has some of the worst traffic. Our solutions are not solutions. Build more lanes. It's not working. It's just, it actually might be making things worse. So critics of adding onto the freeways would say subsidizing the infrastructure, allowing the government and tax dollars to go towards building more freeways, not only does not help cure congestion, but it actually perpetuates it. It creates more of it, right? Because if we expand, then it continues to be convenient to drive. You alleviate congestion, then driving is still going to be a better option than the lack of public transit options we have. It incentivizes people to continue driving, especially because all the money is going into infrastructure for our cars instead of alternative transit options. And so stage one, cheap empty land. Stage two, build, expand the road. Stage three, because you've built, because you've expanded the road, you get more development, more housing, more businesses, and more profit, and more people and more traffic. Stage four, you need to build and expand the road again. And then you just continue to repeat this. It just continues to sprawl. The rule of thumb is that for each lane you add to the freeway in LA, it alleviates congestion at that point for about 5 years. And then you are right back where you were 5 years ago before you built that lane. It's not a solution. It perpetuates and even it encourages sprawl. And so has all this investment reduced traffic jams? The answer is no. Los Angeles rush hour drivers wasted 136 hours a year in slow or stop traffic in 2002. That's days, just days wasted. If you look at the bottom below the picture on the slide, it says weekly hours of congestion, 85. So 85 hours of the week in LA, the roads are congested. That means 3.5 days, half the week, it's traffic jams. Do we need more and better roads? Do we not have enough freeways? Or should we be asking a different question? Do we have too much sprawl? Are we designing and planning our cities in unsustainable and undesirable ways? Main causes of sprawl. Desirability is one factor. Surveys do show that people say they like living out here, right? It's sort of the best of both worlds, right? You've got the detached single family home, privacy, space, sort of that small town rural feel, but also big city access, right? You're connected via freeways and roads to the city. Sort of the best of both worlds, right? This is not the whole story, and it ignores the organizational structural factors that have led us to this situation. So why do we have sprawl? Increases in vehicle miles traveled in the 1940s, which you can see on the graph, corresponded with several other changes. So you can see from 1920 up till past 2005, up until the 40s, especially 1945, there's a little bit of a tick of an increase in people driving, but it's after the 40s that this really takes off and vehicle miles traveled increases a lot. This corresponds, this is not an accident, it doesn't exist in a vacuum, and it corresponds with several other specific changes, some of which we'll discuss. So people start driving a lot more in the 40s. And one reason we have sprawl is we don't have decent public transportation for the most part in the US. Why is our public transportation the worst in the industrialized world? One factor is that trolleys, public transit systems, were purposely and methodically destroyed. General Motors, during the 1940s, under its front company, National City Lines, targeted over 100 major U.S. cities, bought up the public transportation systems in them, slowly dismantled them, converted them to buses, which they purposely made the buses run in a way that no one wanted to ride them. What many of us think of today, or at least 10 years ago when we think of a bus, is because of GM. Buses used to be clean, convenient, efficient, and so what GM did is they converted trolleys to buses to motorize the city, and then stopped taking care of the buses. They stopped servicing them. They started cutting routes. They started making the time in between locations longer and longer. Say it used to be 5 minutes, now it's a half hour. Maybe there used to be 10 buses every hour, now there's one. They made it so shitty, so inconvenient, so smelly and gross that people stopped riding them. And because no one was riding them, they weren't making any revenue. They couldn't justify fixing the buses, and they just let them fall apart. You can see that pictured on the slide. And so this was not an accident. This was done on purpose. At the time, before national city lines emerged, 9 in 10 people rode public transit. And that means 90% of the market was never going to buy a car. Well, GM couldn't let that happen. They had to get rid of public transit to pave the open road for cars. Also, National City Lines, the front company for GM, the other subsidiaries, the funders, GM, National City Lines is composed of GM, California Standard Oil, which is now Chevron, and Firestone Tires. Those are the owners of public transit National City Lines. There's an excellent documentary made in 1996 called Taken for a Ride that goes through what GM did and this whole streetcar conspiracy, which they were actually found guilty of monopolizing the sale of streetcars. They got found guilty for what they did, and the mastermind behind the whole thing, something like $300 billion of infrastructure they destroyed, the mastermind behind the whole thing got fined $1. And so what you should do now is go ahead and watch the first 17 minutes of the documentary, just to give you an idea of some of the things we've been talking about. The whole documentary is available. It's about an hour. You only need to watch the first 17 minutes. So go ahead and pause the lecture. Either type in the link on the slide, or I've also included the link in the description box for this YouTube lecture. So you can copy and paste it from there, pop it into your browser, and watch the first 17 minutes of Taken for a Ride. I think you'll like it. It's pretty good. And then go ahead and come back and join me for the rest of lecture. Okay, so hopefully you went and watched the first 17 minutes of the film to see what GM or National City Lines did. The reason we're all driving cars, the reason we have traffic, that we don't have public transit is not inevitable. It's not an accident. It was done on purpose by a handful of powerful, wealthy people. This dismantling of public transit to make way for freeways and cars. This is also the plot line for the movie Who Framed Roger Rabbit. And so I don't think the link here works. I like to show the part in the movie that talks about it. But in the movie, the villain, Judge Doom, has this plan to build freeways that go through our towns and are spattered with cheap motels, and all along the routes are entrances and exits and people getting on and off the freeway all day long. And cheaply, fastly prepared food, i.e. fast food, cheap motels, and gas stations littered everywhere. And in order to sort of build this, Judge Doom is going to need to destroy Toontown. And so all the characters, the good characters, right, say, why would anyone want to drive on the freeway when they can take the trolley? And the villain, Judge Doom, says, I bought the trolley system, so that Judge Doom can destroy it and make way for cars. So this is actually the plot line of Who Framed Roger Rabbit also, if you're interested. Here's a map of the rail system in LA before GM bought it up. In its early years, the system was purchased by this real estate tycoon, Henry Huntington. And he started operating it in 1901. At the height, the system contained over 20 streetcar lines, and it had 1,250 trolleys. Most of them ran through the core of LA, but they served nearby neighborhoods from LA to Echo Park, Hancock Park, West Adams, Crenshaw, Lincoln Heights, etc. And so the system was sold off in 1945 by Huntington's estate to National City Lines. Again, National City Lines, owned by GM, Chevron, and Firestone Tires, was buying up public transit across the country at this time. And so and again, later they were convicted of conspiring to monopolize the sale of buses. And so when they bought the train, the trolley system, they converted the lines to buses in the late 40s and early 50s. And then National City Lines started cutting routes, making the buses smelly, inconvenient, not taking care of them, so that they became inconvenient and people didn't want to ride them, and they also weren't a viable option anymore. People started turning to cars. Right? Before this, 9 in 10 people rode the trolley. After, here we are. San Diego also had fairly efficient public transit. Here's a map of San Diego's electric railway system. It operated from 1892 to 1949, and you could get from La Jolla to downtown in 38 minutes. In 1949, the system was sold off and replaced by buses. The buyer was a GM executive, and immediately after, it then took by bus over 1 hour to get to La Jolla. And that slowly just got worse and worse. They slowly dismantled the buses, let them fall apart. Ridership was so low they couldn't justify fixing them, and they got junked. Again, the mastermind behind the whole conspiracy fined $1. So is sprawl just what people want? And the evidence suggests no, it's not. There's specific organizational and structural factors that encourage and create sprawl. We're going to look at specific examples, starting with subsidies, tax dollars. The way that subsidies are set up make it cheaper to live in the suburbs because people living there aren't really paying the full cost. Those costs are externalized onto all of us. They also don't pay the full cost of driving to the suburbs or using the infrastructure that has to reach all the way out there. There's also explicit policies, planning and zoning and parking requirements that made urban living more expensive and suburban living cheaper, which also incentivizes sprawl. And so if we created different policies, would we therefore have different outcomes? And so we'll look at some alternatives as well, possible solutions. And then one last example of the mortgage income tax deduction we'll talk about when we get to it. So subsidies first. Housing subsidies, the unnatural American dream. The American dream, the detached single family home, this was not made in a vacuum. It's a result of specific historical developments, choices, policies, and subsidies. And so where do the subsidies go? Housing subsidies. In 1934, the Federal Housing Administration was established, and this was sort of during the heart of the Great Depression under FDR. The idea of the Housing Administration was to get people building houses. This provides jobs, and it also provides housing for people. They discouraged multifamily units. The focus was on the single-family home because you can build more and sell more, right? More jobs, more housing. Despite the initial aims of the subsidies, most houses were actually purchased by the more affluent. After World War II, the Federal Housing Administration has an even bigger effect. There's a big need of housing at this time because very little building went on during the war. For example, the Detroit Free Press, 1945, soldiers can't come home. There aren't any houses. Subsidies grew dramatically at this time. And so the result of increased housing subsidies is who benefited? Again, mostly the affluent. This is where the money went. It went to house building in agricultural lands that were to become the suburbs. There's a study in St. Louis that looked at where the subsidies went from 1934 to 1960. So if you look at city versus country, country meaning suburban, there's five times the amount of money went to the suburbs than it did to the city. And the average loan each person in the suburbs got was about 6 times higher than the average loan the person in the city got. So if you look, only about 12,000 loans to the city, over 60,000 went to the county, the suburbs. Total amount of money, about 94 million to the city. Almost 600 million to the county. Average loan per person in the city, a little over 100, close to 800 for people in the suburbs. And so if the money, you get more money, more of a subsidy, cheaper rent, if you will, by living in the suburbs, what does this then encourage? It encourages people to live there. Not just housing subsidies, so people aren't paying the full cost of housing because they're getting tax dollars, government money for that house. We also subsidize highways and the infrastructure in these sprawl developments. So the roads to get out there and the infrastructure, meaning the water and sewer lines, the phone and electric lines, schools, all that, all fire and police, all these services that are also required. For example, the community of Westwood, established in 1922. And if you look at the picture on the slide, this is where Westwood went. Look at the sort of advertisement on the right. Westwood, as Westwood develops, watch prices jump. You can get get your place now, right? It's in the heart of assured development. There's nothing here now, but there will be. And you can get a great deal on living out here. And so you pay for the home, you pay for the lot, but what about the roads that had to be built to get out to this sprawl development? The people that benefited and bought these homes didn't pay for those roads. All of us with tax dollars paid for those roads, but not all of us use them, not all of us benefit, right? It's cheaper to live in the suburbs because you're not actually paying the full cost of living out there. The roads, the infrastructure, we all pay into that, but we don't all use it, right? What about non-price tag costs, like habitat damage, right? That's not even sort of included. And so one of the points is that if these externalities were actually priced in, the extra infrastructure to create sprawl developments, the roads, the habitat damage, people might make different choices. If we actually priced the true costs into what we pay, people probably would not make these choices. They would not live in sprawl developments. And we wouldn't have all the associated costs with sprawl, environmental damage, climate change, social consequences. And so we all pay through taxes for infrastructure, roads, police, fire. But the infrastructure costs for spread out housing developments are way more expensive than concentrated multi-dwelling units. So if you look at the chart, infrastructure includes local streets, water, sewer lines, recreational facilities, and then also police, fire, solid waste collection and disposal, library, health, and general government. And so all these services, all this infrastructure that people use, we all pay for it, but it costs so much more to develop this in sprawled areas. So for example, a single family unit on 1 acre, so a home, one single family home on 1 acre, about 60,000 in total costs for infrastructure and service costs. By comparison, more concentrated multi-unit dwellings, garden apartments, 15 units per acre, half, only 30,000 in infrastructure costs. And for 30 units per acre, only about 16,000 respectively. Because you need less overall infrastructure because it's not so spread out. Therefore, it costs less. And so all taxpayers pay for these services, for this infrastructure that serve these single family homes. But not everyone lives in a single family home. Rich people, affluent people, people living in the suburbs are getting twice the subsidy of the poor. We all pay for the cost of them being spread out, but only some get to enjoy the benefits. Other examples. And we're going to look at sort of a lot of different examples of what encourages and creates sprawl. So keeping the big picture in mind, that this idea that it's not natural or inevitable. Vehicle subsidies. People that live in sprawl developments that have to drive out there and commute to work also don't pay the full cost of vehicle use. This comes from the Congress Office of Technology Assessment. Vehicle users pay only 68% of actual highway costs and only 60% of actual vehicle use costs. They say that landing on the moon was a wild dream the last time drivers actually paid the full cost of driving on the roads. Everyone pays for this infrastructure, for securing fossil fuels, for all these other things that go into driving, into building the roads. Not everyone drives, and not everyone drives the same amount, right? People that are walking and bicycling, they're paying into all these subsidies for drivers. What are they get? They're not getting a subsidy for walking, right? Or riding their bike. Without subsidies, the costs for drivers would increase by about 30%. And so if drivers actually paid the full cost, this love of driving, the individual default, oh, we love cars, that's why we drive, this would greatly reduce, right? Subsidies, them not paying the full cost of driving results in them driving more. And these vehicle costs, that's not even including the cost of invading other countries to secure oil supplies, right? That would increase things even more. And so one of the main points is we need environmentally honest pricing. We need to include all the internal costs of production and marketing, of making the stuff, and also all the external costs to human health and the environment through pollution or whatever else. These externalities need to start being priced in if consumers are to actually make rational choices. But it's difficult to measure these externalities. How do you measure what a ton of CO2 should cost someone to emit? Right? How do you put a price tag on that? So it's tricky. On the slide, the trade-offs and advantages of environmental taxes and fees. One advantage is by pricing in the true cost of production of the stuff we use, including the externalities in the price tag, it will bring about honest pricing so that consumers either don't want to pay that full cost and they'll switch to other companies or other products that may be more sustainable, or if they'll pay that full cost and the money can be used to offset damage done to the environment or other. Second, the advantages. By including externalities, it encourages businesses to develop environmentally beneficial technologies and goods to save money. So if it becomes more expensive to be polluting rather than green, companies will change what they're doing. They'll become more green in order to cut their costs, stay profitable, and stay in business, right? It's about the way the policies in the system is set up that structures the incentives that drives the behavior. We've got to get the incentives right if we want to have different outcomes. Another benefit is this could be easily administered by the existing tax agencies we already have. We already have a tax structure to collect and redistribute wealth. So we could use that. Disadvantages, and this is a huge one. Low income groups are penalized unless safety nets are provided. So for example, a gas tax, which we have in California, and just a bit hypothetical here. So say, hypothetically, for gas, if we have a gas tax, let's say you have to pay 10 cents more per gallon of gas, and then that tax goes to offsetting the environmental impact of carbon emissions or whatever. Okay, for some people that might be inconvenient or kind of annoying, or maybe you don't get to go out to eat quite as much, whatever. But for other people, that 10 cents, that 1/10 of a dollar, that's the difference between putting dinner on the table for them and their kids that night and not. And so there has to be social safety nets, mechanisms in place to protect vulnerable populations so that people aren't unequally affected by this, unequally burdened by pricing these externalities in. Also, another disadvantage, it's hard to determine the optimal level for taxes and fees. How much should CO2 emission cost? How much should, fertilizer dumping too much fertilizer on your lawn cost, right? How do you actually measure this stuff and put a price tag on it? And then one other disadvantage, governments, and they do this all the time, might use the money as general revenue. So basically use the money for whatever the fuck they want instead of actually using it towards improving environmental quality, reducing taxes on income. They might not use the money for what they're supposed to use it for. This just happened with some of the coronavirus CARES Act money coming out for small businesses. It went to like private schools and sports teams, not really small businesses. Okay, so subsidies. People don't pay the true cost of the houses or the transportation to get there or the infrastructure that has to be built all the way out there. And it makes living in sprawl development cheaper than it really is. Many of the costs are externalized. There's also policies that have made urban living more expensive and sprawl development cheaper, at least artificially in the price tag. Again, because all these costs are externalized. And so let's focus on explicit policy for a moment. Planning and zoning requirements. The earliest example of explicit policies surrounding zoning, and zoning means this area is zoned for residential and that you can only have housing here. You can't have business or other activities. So it's zoned as residential or business or other. And the earliest example of this in the US comes from San Francisco in 1867. The idea was isolate the dangerous, the odoriferous, stuff that people don't want in their backyard, like tar boiling, carcass burning, fat rendering, other sort of smelly or dangerous activities. Zone them to a separate area so that it's to keep property values up, keep residential communities nicer. In LA by 1909, zoning requirements began to extend to large undeveloped areas. So this area is and will be only for housing. The focus was on the single family home versus other uses like business or recreational. And the goal was to protect property values. Don't allow other offensive activities in the same area. Keep the property values up. There was a huge legal issue battle over this because for a lot of people this doesn't work, right? A lot of people like to live, work, play all in the same areas and don't have a means to commute to these different destinations. Zoning ended up winning, and after 1945, this led to huge zones of developmental uniformity. So housing only, no mixed use, no businesses allowed, which means people, when they go to work, have to travel far to get to work. It can't be in the same community. Sort of the extreme of developmental uniformity is gated communities, right? Or homeowners associations where everyone's house has to be the same color of taupe and you can't park on the street and you can't have your I remember a neighborhood around where I lived. I didn't live in it, but you couldn't park cars on the street. You could have one car in the driveway and that's it. If people came to visit, I'd fucking figure it out. You weren't allowed to park in the streets. They didn't like how it looked. So that's sort of on the extreme side. One alternative to uniform homogeneous zoning is mixed use. Um, so see sort of on the bottom versus the top picture, have residential, but also business, also stores, healthcare, recreational, all these different things we do, have it all be in the same place so people don't have to drive and travel really far in between what they're doing. Another example, subdivision requirements in sprawl developments also eat up and waste land, which means we have to build even more sprawled infrastructure to reach these units. Everyone pays for that. Not everyone enjoys the benefits. Examples of subdivision requirements. There's setback requirements. So the house has to be a certain distance from the driveway. You have a long driveway because it looks pretty. Whoever decided. A minimum lot size. So it can only be it has to be at least this big. Minimum street width. And also, ironically, with all these requirements, there's also open space requirements, right? Where there can't really be anything. One alternative, because all of these things encourage more spread out development, one alternative to this is something called cluster development. And so cluster development is one subdivision with one transit line, one sewer line, one water line, etc. And so you just have one main transit and infrastructure line, and then the housing is built all along that. It cuts down on costs and environmental impacts big time. Other policies that have encouraged sprawl, created it even. Uh, Beginning in the 1940s, there started to be policies that required businesses and apartments in the city to provide parking. Well, not just in the city, but that's where it's a little more difficult to find parking, right? So in 1946, and remember, National City Line starts buying up public transit in the 1940s. All these things sort of start coalescing. In 1946, only 17% of US cities had requirements for parking, that businesses have to provide parking. In just 5 years, by 1951, 71% of US cities had these parking requirements. And the result is increased costs in the cities because businesses and apartments pass the cost of these required parking services onto the consumer, either through paycheck deduction or through increased rent. Even if it's not explicitly passed on, the cost is passed on, which makes urban living more expensive. The result is housing costs are higher in these areas. It becomes cheaper to live in sprawled development. Shoot, wrote this book, The High Cost of Free Parking, just more on minimum parking requirements. He says the average car is parked 95% of the time, so most of the time, yet it uses 3 to 4 spaces. I mean, remember LA, 60% of the land area is devoted to pavement. You have a space at home, but you also have a space when you drive to school. There's also a space you use when you go to the store, when you go to work. And so parking is free for 99% of trips and free for 90% of jobs, but it's not free in actual costs. Again, it's passed on to the consumer in rent, or at SDSU, for example, they take the money out of faculty paychecks to pay for parking. So it's not actually free. And there's all these other externalities, environmental and social costs. While an office worker needs on average 250 square feet of space, his or her car requires 400 square feet of space. It's estimated that 2 billion spaces exist in this country, but only 200 million cars. So 2 billion spaces, but only 200 million cars. Today, it's more like 260, 270 million, but still serves the same point. And Shoup said one study in LA, 30% of traffic in LA was just people driving around looking for free spaces, looking for somewhere to park. That's a million extra miles a year, just looking for parking. Shoup says that he calls it a real estate subsidy for the affluent, right? We all pay into the parking, the infrastructure, this increased costs, but not everyone drives. Not everyone drives as much. Not everyone uses these services, but we all pay. So we've been talking about the problems. Are there alternatives? One possible solution to cars, parking requirements, all this other stuff is automobility systems like Zimride or Zipcar. You can rent cars by the hour or the day. Gas and insurance is included. And so if you don't drive a lot, this actually can save you quite a bit of money on car ownership, because if you own a car, it has to be insured, right? Whether you're using it or not. Automobility systems, you just sort of pay when you're using it and then don't pay when you're not using it. They're available in different cities and airports around the world. You can save hundreds of dollars on car ownership. You can choose from different types of cars, vans, hybrids, sedans. Membership as low as $6 a month. It depends on what you're doing. Or Lyft and Uber as other examples, these rideshare services. If we're doing rideshare, we need less parking, less infrastructure. Remember, you need about 250 square feet of space. Your car needs about 400 square feet of space. So we could save on this with rideshare. Scooters as another alternative. Walking, we could walk. Americans walk the least of any industrialized nation. Studies employing pedometers found that the average Australian takes about 9,600 steps per day. The average Japanese, a little over 7,000. The Swiss, almost 10,000. The average American takes about 5,000 steps a day. No one walks in this country. And so houses seem cheaper because so many costs aren't in the price tag. The excess roads, the infrastructure, the services required to accommodate sprawl development. It's just not included. And so it's artificially cheaper, but the costs continue socially and environmentally to mount. Common realtor advice, drive until you can afford it. Because the further out you go, usually the cheaper housing is. And this incentivizes people to live in sprawled developments. For example, if you try to buy a house in San Diego, on a budget, are you going to go look in La Jolla or sort of downtown Little Italy, or are you going to have better luck finding something affordable maybe in La Mesa or El Cajon, right, or National City? And so evidence suggests sprawl is not just what people want. There's specific policies, choices, and structures that have created it for us. And so if we had different policies, could we achieve different outcomes? Are there alternatives to the way we're doing things? And the answer is yes. So let's look at a couple of examples. Example one, Germany. And so again, if we did different policies, different outcomes. So they are home of the Autobahn system, which is sort of a model interstate system. It's a freeway system that doesn't really have a speed limit. You can drive pretty fast. But one of the reasons that this works is because in Germany, cars, the Autobahn is not the only mode of transportation. So you have different options depending on where you're going. If you want to take a long trip on the Autobahn, go for it. It's fairly efficient. And because it's only used for certain trips or going certain places, and what I mean is there's not an entrance and an exit ramp every 100 feet for people to get on and off. There's few and far in between, which is sort of why it works. People can go fast, go long distances, get where they're going. If they want to make a shorter trip or a different type of trip, there's other types of transportation that exist for that. And so the car is an option, but it's not the primary form of transportation. Germany is also home to a dense railroad network. The country's roughly the size of Alabama, but you can catch a train without leaving major airports, and from there you can get to most cities pretty easily. And so it's a good example of efficient public transportation. They have a combination. There's options for cars, but also public transit. I mean, Europe in general, through planning and policy and the way they've designed their streets, cars are sort of more expensive and more inconvenient, and public transit is cheaper and more convenient, just through the way things have been designed. Example two, Curitiba, Brazil. And so in Curitiba, it a few decades ago was not very densely populated and also not very affluent. In 1950, the population was around 300,000. By 1990, it had increased sixfold up to 1.7 million. And so a lot of development also occurred coinciding with this population growth. And in 1971, the mayor made a conscious choice in how they decided to design the city. And they decided to go for sustainable design consciously. And so they have a city center with a pedestrian mall you can see pictured on the slide. And they emphasize parks, so open space, recreational, but also mixed use so that housing, jobs, healthcare, school, transport, all these things are in the same area so that sprawl and driving are not necessary. And what they did is they interlinked growth axes, areas that were growing, with mass transit. So development only occurred along mass transit lines or areas that were linked to them. They were able to do this at 6 times the normal housing density to relative to other areas. And also low income housing was emphasized. So it's not just for the wealthy or the affluent, but for everyone. And it was designed as an integrated system with healthcare, transportation, housing, jobs, all integrated and connected to cut down on the consequences of sprawl and driving. And so what I want you to do now is we're going to watch one more clip. Go ahead, pause the lecture, and type in or copy and paste from the description box of this video the link I have on the slide. And it's less than 2 minutes long. It's talking about what happened in Curitiba, Brazil. So go ahead, pause lecture, watch the clip. It's less than 2 minutes, and then come back to lecture. We have just a few more things to talk about before we wrap up. Okay, so hopefully you watched the clip. And I sort of like what the guy says at the end. The cars are like your mother-in-law, right? You need to have a good relationship, but you cannot lead them to determine and lead your lives, right? You can't let them determine your life, just like the mother-in-law. And so in Curitiba, they have one of the things they did was this bus system that has these tube stations pictured here. And so there's no steps, which means it's handicap accessible. You can get right from the station onto the bus. There's 245 routes, so you can get all over the area. 17,300 daily trips, so it's convenient. You're not waiting hours in between buses. Actually, you're waiting less than a minute. During rush hour, buses come once per minute, sometimes even once per 30 seconds. Also, the buses are able to operate the traffic lights, so they sort of have priority. So if the bus is coming, that should stay green or turn green for them. This makes it more efficient for buses versus cars, which sort of incentivizes people to take the bus. It might be quicker, it might be more convenient. The goal is make that more convenient, incentivize that, and you'll have people behave differently. People will make different choices. Each bus express lane carries about 20,000 passengers per hour. That's a lot. That's 4 times as much as Rio's new subway carries at 1/200th the cost. So there are alternatives. There are other ways to do things. San Diego's trying to change in terms of transportation. We have the Rapid Bus Project, which has actually been improving, getting sort of bigger and bigger. They're getting more routes around San Diego, connecting major areas like downtown and up north towards Claremont. And even as of 2018, the buses are now on the 805 and some of the major freeways. The idea is have direct routes, have frequent intervals, make taking the bus more convenient and attractive than driving your car. And just recently, any of you that have been on El Cajon in North Park, I'm not sure how much of El Cajon has changed, maybe the whole road, but it used to be 3 lanes for cars. Now it's only 2 lanes, and the 3rd lane is dedicated to buses only, right? So that lane's clear. The buses actually can usually move faster than the cars. Make that more convenient than driving. On the trolley, we have a few other examples of San Diego trying to change. One of the problems is we have built all these freeways and roads over previous public transportation systems, and you can't just undo that, right? We can't just go back over that. Sort of the damage has sort of been done, so we have to work within the existing infrastructure now. Third and last example, sustainable design in how you build homes. And so this example comes from Davis, California in the late 1970s. They built these village homes. And at the time, realtors shunned the idea. These places now sell for much higher price comparative to nearby areas. And so they were basically practicing sustainable design before it was fashionable. Some of the things they did in the Davis Village homes, instead of putting in concrete drains for water management, they use swales. So swale, basically like a grassy depression or a little irrigation ditch. And so you don't need the concrete. It's also more aesthetically pleasing. There's less heat creation, and it's more environmentally friendly. It also helps with water conservation. The water can be reabsorbed into the ground and the grass and the soil instead of running off into the sewer system. They have narrower streets, and also the streets are lined by these green belts. So there's more open green space, less asphalt and concrete. One of the results of this is summer outdoor temperatures are 15 degrees lower. Because you don't all have all those blacktops, those streets absorbing and re-radiating heat. Like the darker the surface, the more heat it collects, which is then released back out. Housing is at 2 times the average density, but because of the way it was built, there's 25% more open space relative to nearby areas. And streets enter sort of on opposite sides. So there's streets that pass through the housing development, but they don't cross each other, right? You go in and out on the same street, so that if you want to get anywhere else, you have to walk. And so car use is 15 to 20% lower than average, and residents know 3 times as many neighbors. This is also good, right? Social interaction leads to group and collective action, collective problem solving. And the houses use passive solar cooling and heating. So they face the greenways, and just by the way the architecture is designed and the surroundings are designed, the heating and cooling for the home is regulated more by the design, by the way the sunlight enters or doesn't enter the house, by what type of materials surround the outside of the house. And so home energy costs are 50 to 60% lower because people don't need to use heating and AC nearly as much, if at all. Originally, realtors shunned the idea. They thought it was stupid. These houses now sell for more than other areas. $11 more per square foot to be exact. And so is sprawl just what people want? No, and there's other ways that we could be doing this. One last example that of encouraging sprawl, which is something called the mortgage tax deduction. Just a quick last example to wrap up. So take this mansion located at 16270 Via de la Valle, Rancho Santa Fe, California. 8 bedrooms, 14 baths, giant ass kitchen, a gym, pool, an equestrian facility with 7 stalls in the barn for your horses, parking for 9 vehicles, although I bet you could fit way more than that. A pool, all the luxuries. Asking price just a little over 15 million at the time. This was listed a couple of years ago. And guess what? You, with your tax dollars, are helping pay for this person's mansion. Have you ever heard of the middle class mortgage deduction? Essentially, what it allows people to do is if they have bought a home, they can deduct a percentage of what they pay on their mortgage from their taxes. And so if I bought a home and paying all this money on my mortgage, I put that on my taxes, and basically I get money back on my taxes, which is akin to a pay raise. So $100 billion per year is spent on the middle class mortgage deduction. Because it's for homeowners only, none of it goes to renters. 30% of households, if not more, are renters. These are probably the people that need subsidies and monetary assistance. Of the 100 billion, 10% of that goes just to the top 0.7%. So less than a percent. 10% goes to less than the top 1%. These are households that own over 200,000 per year, make over 200,000 per year. And then 50% of that 100 billion goes to the top 10%, households that make over 100,000 per year. For $200,000 income households, that means that they're getting $15,000 to $20,000 back on their income taxes. They're getting a check essentially for almost 20 grand each year because they can deduct what they pay in their taxes because they're paying it on their mortgage. It's a mansion subsidy. It doesn't do anything to encourage home ownership among the less affluent because the amount of money you get back is dependent on how expensive the house is. So if it's not that expensive, you're not really getting that much money back on your taxes. And what it does is it encourages larger houses, especially among the affluent, because the more expensive of the house that I buy, the bigger the check I'm going to get on my taxes. So yeah, it doesn't incentivize homeownership as it was originally designed to do, and actually it rewards the already affluent that can already afford to buy houses. This just to show you sort of another example of what I'm talking about. Only 1/3 of combined spending on the mortgage income deduction and Section 8 go to low income housing. Basically, the money that is supposed to help people with housing doesn't go to people that need help. We find that although renter households are far more likely to need assistance, federal housing benefits go disproportionately to homeowners. In fact, the amount spent on the mortgage income deduction is well over double the amount that goes to Section 8. So 71 billion spent on the mortgage income deduction or middle class income deduction and only 30 billion on Section 8. So just to give you an idea where the subsidies go to the more affluent. So in sum, is sprawl just what people want? Is it just a force of nature? These natural processes are aided by direct subsidies of housing costs, makes houses cheaper because people don't pay the full cost. Indirect subsidies of highways and infrastructure. People that live in sprawl development don't pay the full cost of the roads and the infrastructure required. And explicit policies like parking and zoning requirements that make city living more expensive, and indirect subsidies like the mortgage tax deduction, which actually pay people for buying big houses. Otherwise, yeah, sprawl is natural and just what people want. Right? If you take out all of these subsidies and the policies that encourage and create sprawl and highways and car use and spread out infrastructure, then yeah, they're natural processes. Right? The point is these things are not inevitable. They're built into the system, and often in ways that benefit a few of us rather than the majority of us. And so that'll do it for Sprawl. We have just one more quick talk this week. It'll be short on sort of the future. If things aren't set in stone, if this isn't inevitable, what might the future look like, and what can we do to shape it how we want it to be to get different outcomes? So we'll sort of touch on that and wrap up the course in our next talk, and then that'll do it for us. All right, take care.